Listen.
Posłuchaj.
Écoute.
Roma, 聞いてください。
Escucha. MCO.
Listen.
MCO.
MCO.
Between the Bars.
Hi, I'm Yannick Dondelinger. Welcome back, finally and thankfully, to Between the Bars and the Mahler Chamber Orchestra, a community where life and music mix and mingle. Our last episode, Mozart on the Edge of Brexit, was released way back in May, and since then, the MCO, like most probably all orchestras around the world, has had a lot on its plate to deal with. Life imitates art far more than art imitates life. That quote is one of Irish poet Oscar Wilde's most famous. Well, I'm going to disagree with Mr. Wilde and say that this year, 2020, and in the years to come, music and the arts will imitate life and be affected by our COVID times in ways that are probably not yet even conceivable. Sit back, relax, and welcome to Future Fear, Future Fantastic.
My father was a soldier. He was young and he was pretty.
Violinist, improviser, and conductor Pekka Kuusisto, serenading me an old Finnish military song from his cadenza to Georgi Ligeti's violin concerto. From an early age, Pekka was a super talent on the violin, but freely admits to also being brought up with a home life and a musical ecosystem that encouraged a deep interest in other musical genres: jazz, improvisation, folk music, and electronics. To tell you the truth, he has a natural inquisitiveness towards the world in general. And so, while going on to build a hugely diverse international career on his violin, Pekka, through his performances, has explored many of today's pressing issues, such as climate change, gender equality, and what some would say is the lost art of free thought.
Certainly, it's not getting any easier to think freely. The only place you can get away from marketing is your dreams.
I had the pleasure to chat and play music with him 1 year ago now, late last November 2019 in Dortmund, Germany, during a very special Mahler Chamber Orchestra Academy project. The interview was pre-COVID and relaxed, but was also an uncanny portent to what the future holds, not only for classical music, but life as we know it in general. 1 billion songs on Spotify, the female designers at Volvo, comedian Louis C.K., a virtual Elvis Presley, a humming fridge, and a giant red dress. They're all on Pekka's mind, and more. But first, have a listen to this. MCO violinist Tim Summers improvising a duet with a computer program. This clip comes from our #KeepPlaying campaign that you might remember back in the spring near the beginning of the corona crisis. Tim is reflecting on harmony, something sorely needed in the world today, and how harmony in music keeps the many diverse musicians of the Mahler Chamber Orchestra together round the globe, even when we can't meet up in person. Let's jump into my chat with Pekka, where we start talking about audiences and performers, and how separated they've become by the classical music experience. Pekka lands at something called the Red Dress Project, an idea of how to break down these barriers and deepen communication in the concert hall.
The red dress you mentioned.
Yes.
So it was created by a friend of mine called Aamu Song.
Yeah.
It
was a very big red dress.
It's a massive red dress.
Massive.
And she grew up in South Korea, and she's been living in Finland for more than 15 years now. The idea of red dress was born out of her going to concerts when she was young and growing up in Seoul, and always wondering, what is this invisible wall between the performers and the audience? So the red dress, the performer wears the dress, and the dress has 238 pockets, I think. So the audience climbs into those pockets, and when the concert starts, when the performance starts, whatever it is, a song recital, a improvised violin concert, or a lecture about the universe, it can be anything, everyone's wearing the same dress. So the wall between audience and performers is completely gone.
Have you ever had the opportunity to be on the pocket side of the dress? Or?
Yeah, several times.
Okay.
I've gotten to plan a bunch of red dress residencies where the dress gets set up in a place, and then we curate a bunch of different performances.
Right.
There was a week in Helsinki a few years ago when it literally went from electronic pop to this lecture about the universe, to Baroque arias, to Iva Bittova playing violin and singing traditional songs. And it was really, anything works. The dress makes anything into very direct communication. It erases the kind of the part of a concert experience that is against communication, which I think a lot of people feel. You know, if there's such a thing as a regular orchestra concert, for example, some people feel the customs so foreign that it actually hinders the idea of the music to go through, and then accidentally people blame the music and not the customs, not the habits. One thing that my head keeps coming back to is the the idea of us having to renew the classical music concert format.
That's almost maybe becoming a cliche phrase. I understand.
I think it sort of did
a long time ago, maybe.
And I think that like the opportunity now is, or like the point of the whole thing is to not say that what we've been doing and what like 99% of the business is doing is wrong, but just that we've got this opportunity where we can actually experiment.
Yes.
That something has clicked and we are not completely so bound to it. I think Charles Rosen wrote somewhere that the death of classical music is its longest running tradition. And that since hundreds of years ago, people have been predicting the death of this art form.
Maybe it's not a case of one needs to, maybe one doesn't talk about reinventing something. It's just a case of allowing it to have more than one life.
Exactly. And often I get the feeling, especially with maybe less thoroughly planned endeavors, that you accidentally transmit the idea that the audience we have is not good enough for us, that we want to sort of change the audience.
Yeah.
Like when we play a Mahler symphony, you suddenly want to have only maximum 27-year-old people in the audience. I would be worried if that would happen. Like, what's going on with those 20-something people if they want to,
On the subject of 20-something-year-olds, the conversation moves to what MCO and Pekka are doing in Dortmund. Shapeshifters. Mahler Chamber Orchestra's Academy Week, with music students from places as far-flung as Australia and South America, as well as more locally, from Europe and North Rhine-Westphalia's own Orchestercentrum. The point of the Shapeshifters experiment is to bring the audience closer, emotionally and physically, to the performers, as well as lifting the musicians well out of their comfort zone and into the hands of the audience. Acting and meditating, props and staging, costumes and bare feet. I asked Pekka what he thinks we can all learn from this mash-up experiment.
Maybe the most that nobody thinks what we do in the concert is the goal. That this is just like a super small step of letting or encouraging people to start thinking about possible futures for what we do. So it's just like a little nudge in a direction. Although it does feel quite massive in some of the rehearsals, what we're doing, kind of very massively different from what we're used to doing. But that it's just hopefully a start of a process for everyone.
Yeah. You say this, you talk about this a lot, Pekka, changing the way we listen. I don't know, sometimes that might sound like a weird phrase for a musician, change the way you listen. We assume you either listen or you don't listen. Sometimes it's like on, off.
It's more
but this week,
than that.
I think it's much more complicated.
It's funny you would say that right now because I just started observing the hum of the refrigerator about 2 meters away from me.
That would be Matty giving you the evil eye.
Me too.
Hashtag you too.
Trust Pekka to be fascinated by the humming of a hotel minibar. I hope that's not a reflection on my newbie interviewing skills. he would be too polite to say. But fridges and the sound of listening, a phrase Mahler Chamber Orchestra uses more and more in describing itself, bring Pekka's thoughts back to the American composer Paulina Oliveros and her improvisation work, 13 Changes, that Pekka and MCO Academy were performing that week in Germany. Oliveros had a lifelong quest to change the way we listen, a subject I think close to Pekka's heart.
Yeah, no, Pauline Oliveros, her work, her concept is called deep listening. Actually, it's a funny thing. I saw her. I never met her. I saw her once, maybe like 15 years ago or something. Mm-hmm. I was doing something in New York, and there's a wonderful club called The Stone that's run by John Zorn's organization. And it used to be at least on, I think, like 2nd Street and Avenue C or something like that. And it's all improvised music. Back then, I think it was a couple of sets a night. And each month would be curated by a fun musician. And there would be, like, all the ticket money would go directly to the performers.
Wow.
And they would sell only the records of the performers and the records that John Zorn had made to support the club. It was like really pure music lovers heaven.
Yeah. And all improvised.
All improvised, yeah. And that month was curated by a guitar player called Fred Frith. And that evening when I went there, he was playing with a Norwegian pianist that I had heard of called Else Olsen Storesund. Mm-hmm. And then somebody called Pauline Oliveros, who I hadn't heard of. She was not a part of my education, sadly.
What was she playing?
She was playing accordion, piano.
She was playing accordion.
Yeah. And Fred Frith was playing guitar, and Else Olsen Storesund was playing prepared piano.
Right.
And they were all fantastic. But in a weird way, my attention was being drawn to this sort of aunt sitting with an accordion, looking extremely like Moomin Mama or something, like super friendly, welcoming, and playing sort of much less than the other two. And a kind of
not sportive in any way, just being.
Just being and reacting and listening. And whenever something felt like it was missing, she would play it.
Yeah.
And there was something sort of magical about it. And then I found out her name later, and I put it on my mind, and then gradually started to realize that had I been a bit smarter and a bit faster, I should have gotten to know her properly and to kind of work and study with her.
When we're playing these 13 Changes of Pauline Oliveros, is there a moment where, when we're rehearsing and you think, a moment where it clicks, the listening is going outside from the people themselves to all the other people? People are listening, they're not concentrating on themselves, they're concentrating on everyone except themselves, which is sometimes a very beautiful thing, actually.
It's so beautiful. It's quite rare, especially since we're in this project. Most of us are quite new to this kind of a situation. So it's still, I love what the sounds that people are making. But sometimes we still make the same sound twice.
Yeah.
And you're not allowed to do that. you shouldn't let it become.
I know you hate that.
No, I don't hate it, but it's just, if we want to create musical gestures for these concerts that have, the maximum chance of being proper for the situation that they're performed in, then of course what you can do is you sit in your hotel room and you design your improvisation. But that's not going to...
Do you think people have been doing that? I certainly didn't.
I don't know.
There's some nodding,
that's
nodding
like
going
really
on here.
not the way to do it if you want to start a process for yourself.
Do you think maybe that's a natural reaction when you try something for the first time and you batten the hatches down for safety and
course.
I create nature. Something, it works.
Yeah, and I think according to some research I read lately, it was revealed that sadly humans are kind of generally not interested in new things.
Really?
Yeah, it's not like...
We're not the most adaptable species that...
but it still goes against
exists.
our most primitive... Like if we found something that works,
Right.
don't go changing it. You need to be a little bit crazy to actually want to face new circumstances.
Georgi Ligeti, a composer who in his sound world revelled in facing new circumstances, celebrated the absurd in music, and seemed to have no problems exploring change. That was Pekka and I, busking through Aria, the opening duet for violin and viola, from the second movement of Ligeti's violin concerto, finished in 1993 towards the last decade of his life, but harking back to material written as a young man in his homeland Hungary in the 1950s. It's an ironically nostalgic moment for a man whose greatest quality was arguably the gift of independent thinking. Something Pekka thinks we're in danger of losing today.
There was a big study a couple of months ago, about how difficult it is actually to achieve independent thinking, or sort of basically impossible. Because you're being still, even if you feel like you're coming up with a new thing, you're still doing it based on the structures and the things that you've learned. Yeah, I suppose like we are living in a time when the whole kind of species that we represent has to get to grips with the fact that we've invented all this technology. That
You're
we
really
can
into that
communicate.
technology, aren't you?
I think it's something that will probably, like, people way later will look back at this time. I have this feeling. Of course, things will keep developing that, but the leaps that, like, my dad is 80-something now, and he was already a completely grown man when the first computer arrived. And look where we are now. Like, our whole living environment is based on computing. And a frightening, if you look at your iPhone and check your daily screen time, the species is changing, not through decision or choice, but because of, I suppose it's kind of like when machines and cars became a thing. We had to, just the way we exist, the way we move and live and pace our things had to change, and now it's very much the same. It's just possibly an even bigger leap. Yeah, certainly it's not getting any easier to think freely in general now, because what we do, how we, for example, exist on the internet in various ways, it's something that is being marketed for targeted advertisement.
You believe our input is controlled somehow more? We're not
at
aware
least
that the input
what we face when we journey onto the information superhighway. It's not what we're being served. What it sounds horrible, but the people making money off us think we want to see is what we see. Like, the only place you can get away from marketing is your dreams.
Yeah, but this is beginning to sound a bit like Matrix. I wanted to talk about technology in the way that once I read, and Pekka, you're welcome to tell me I'm quoting completely incorrectly.
Let's see.
A possible future scenario where you would play a concert in your home, let's say if you're in Finland, with your orchestra at home, that would then be beamed instantaneously over to someone, let's say could even be watching with 3D goggles in California the same concert, and that's one possible end game that technology can provide to the issues of climate change and the whole thing of flying in an airplane around the world, playing music. To me, it sounds very scary. I mean, the aspect that you have to travel, you can minimize that with technology, but does that mean then you are living out your life more within your living room? You're consuming what should be a live experience within your living room. In one respect, that means you're a little bit more controlled, because maybe that's the definition of when it's not live. I don't know.
I think the thing you were referring to was an idea of the orchestra being, for example, in San Francisco, and the soloist being, for example, in Pernaja in Finland, where I happen to live. I think it was kind of rooted in an idea that how would it be to compose a piece of music that would work like that? Or would it be possible to write a piece of music that would actually demand this kind of distance? And would it bring something new and exciting to the concert experience, knowing that that's what's actually happening? Elvis played in Helsinki a couple of years ago as a hologram.
Oh, fantastic!
And one of his bands, some members of one of the bands that used to play with him in Vegas or something, was still around to play.
Really?
Yeah. So they flew out to Helsinki, to cold Helsinki, from probably a nice sunny place in the States to play with an hologram of
literally
Elvis.
on stage, playing next to a hologram.
Exactly. I think one of the dangers of, for example, reaching a certain age is that you start thinking about things like, oh, but that sounds ridiculous, and for example, like playing a concert from 8,000 kilometers away. Oh, well, that's never going to be a thing. It's a natural mechanism that kicks in, that it becomes more and more difficult for you to, like on average, to embrace the possibility of things becoming really different in the future.
Yeah.
As I was saying, like, it's just the previous generation from me saw the first computers.
Right.
And we can't spend an hour without using a computer.
Well, we can try.
And fail.
From future technologies, the danger of not accepting change, and the danger of too much change too fast, we move sideways to the topic of gender equality and find ourselves suddenly talking about programming, computers and classical concerts, systems analysis, and designing cars in Sweden.
A bunch of years ago, I remember a project by Volvo, the car maker, where they chose an all-female engineering team to design a car, like a concept car.
Yes.
And then the point was this sort of revolutionary idea that if you would actually let women design it, it would become better. And it sort of did. Yes. And so I think a lot of the ideas that the team came up with were then embraced by the car maker and brought into the mass production cars. And it was wonderful. And a couple of years ago, I got to know this children's book author / programmer called Linda Liukas, who has written storybooks for children about programming called Hello Ruby. And one of the first things that she said to me when I met her was that it's like her main focus is to get girls interested, girls, young girls, to get interested
in programming,
in how computers work, and she is firmly of the opinion that it's a scary future, or it's like a strange future when less and less people understand how the computers work, when less and less of us have
which is what happens when you only have the male species programming.
Yeah, and when you have computers where you're only meant to sort of use a certain type of interface.
Yes.
Like when I was growing up, we would still have to draw up our own software for the computer to be able to make a circle or something on the screen. But you never do that. You don't actually converse with the actual computer. You just converse with the interface that they've made for you.
Yeah.
So she kind of made me realize that the interfaces that we're all using every day are basically all designed by guys. And so one of her missions is to kind of gradually change that. Well, actually, since you mentioned, since we were talking about programming, there was a friend of mine, another friend of mine who is deeply into programming, and he kind of raised the idea or the point that in the 50s, 60s, with the early computers, programming was apparently quite firmly a female-dominated job. It was viewed as something that was, and lack of better words, a woman's job. And then some choices were made, and now I think, of course, it's really quite the opposite.
And in classical music?
Classical music, it's well, I've participated a little bit in kind of the local debate in Finland, but it feels like there's quite a lot of my colleagues who feel that what we do and how it's turned out, it's kind of like law of nature. This is how it has to be. When it comes to contemporary music, I think it's going in a fun direction. I have this weird interest in, I've been dreaming of actually finding some funding for a little study group that would have a couple of musicologists and a couple of really quick score readers. And they would get a salary for a year or two for going to all the warehouses of all the music publishing companies in Europe and all the old important music libraries and seeing if there's something that just kind of didn't get out because it was written by a woman. And some of the researchers or musicologists that I've spoken to think that this is a kind of overwhelmingly likely scenario. And to think that we could have even a small number, 5 to 10 symphonies from the 19th century that we never even heard of because they were just written by women. That would be quite an amazing situation to be in. Totally. To actually get to study those and play them. But it's, the mechanisms are unfortunately I think everyone should participate in the debate, but if you're doing one of our jobs, you're not going to have enough time to actually know, unless you're super talented and a very quick reader and learner, to know how these things work. So I came across a group, a research group at the University of Helsinki. It's called Kuudelma, and I'm intending to rapidly get in touch with them because all they do is they research sort of complete and lasting systemic change. How the way people perceive things, how you understand things, how that changes.
Subject to history, or also sometimes no.
Yeah, so kind of if Finland was kind of super progressive a bit more than 100 years ago. We were the third country in the world to give voting rights to women. This is 1906, and we were the first country in the world to give women the right to actually become parliamentarians that same year. So women have had the opportunity in the world to be members of the parliament for a bit more than 100 years. It's kind of a really embarrassing number for us guys. But so this research group, Kuudelma, would have looked at all the information available about an event such as that, and to possibly try to build a system, a theory, or a formula of how these things change. And then we could call them up and say, hey, can you look at classical music? Yeah. Can you tell us when it's going to be fine? When it's going to start looking very different? And they would probably be able to give some kind of an answer. Wow. And that's kind of fascinating.
A possible future fantastic? Algorithms created by clever systems analysts, showing us a timeline to gender equality in the classical music world. I wonder if these same research brains at Kuudelma, University of Helsinki, are at this moment plotting algorithms for the future timeline of the last and probably most pressing topic in our chat, climate change and its relationship to travel. Here comes a typically astute thought of Pekka's.
It's a weird thought, and I don't have any kind of opinion about it myself, but it just keeps popping up. Do we actually need all this?
Cultural exchange?
No, but like is it using Spotify as an example? Does it sort of benefit us that you have access to 1 billion songs in your pocket and the people who make them?
I can definitely agree on one level, but is there a benefit to having access to someone you actually meet in the flesh and converse with, as opposed to consuming things electronically? I mean, then you get back to the whole question of live music.
It's a very loose thought, but if you think that, like if I live near Helsinki, if I have 12 hours of time, I can meet anyone from like Singapore to Tokyo to Los Angeles to North Africa and to vast parts of Russia. Do I need that? Could I spare a bit more time if I want to meet somebody from one of those places? Do I actually have to? Would it be okay
for the nourishment of yourself?
Exactly, or would there be artistic fulfillment or nourishment if I would, for a period, stick to the people who are sort of within a 10-hour train ride from me?
It's very valid. What's the balance of artistic nourishment? Have we gone completely on the consumption side of the scale, where we just love to consume everything on the planet because it's a beautiful thing and the planet's just lovely to explore?
I'm sort of tempted to think that the world owes us everything.
Yes.
There was this comedian, what was his name? Louis C.K., who a long time ago made this kind of fun statement on one of the talk shows in the States that, you go on an airplane. This was maybe 6 years ago, so internet on airplanes wasn't such a common thing. You go on an airplane, you log on to the internet for the first time in your life on the plane, and then after 15 minutes it breaks down. And then you think, that's bullshit. Because the world already owes you something that you didn't even know existed 15 minutes ago.
Yeah.
And if there would be any sort of justice in the world, everyone sitting on any planes anywhere would be sort of ecstatic at the amazement of actually flying through the air.
Louis C.K. and the impatience of the human condition. So, has the art of consumption taken over from the art of expression? Contrary to what Oscar Wilde thought, does art now actually imitate life? And most importantly, and maybe soberingly, does that art we watch and listen to now look like some kind of huge Truman Show type existence? In which case, are we now in the realm of art imitating life, imitating art? Or should that be the other way around? Enough, yes. It's all way over my pay grade, but there is a point to be made somewhere in this thought soup. Is human nourishment, through expression, discovery and understanding, through art, science and philosophy, is that being replaced by a social media-driven imperative to produce, consume and appear to be on the top of an improbably large pile of success? The kind of success that has you complaining about your Wi-Fi at 12,000 meters in the sky. I read recently an opinion piece that humankind's greatest achievement was not, as many people sometimes think, landing a man on the moon, but was the eradication of smallpox from our planet, a disease that killed more than 300 million people in the 20th century alone. In actual fact, the race to the moon was just that, a political and ideological competition between nations to get to the top of the pile, this particular pile being the moon. The discoveries and revelations were historic, monumental, sure, but it was still just a competition, driven at full speed by human impatience to be first and the fear of being last. So are we today consuming rather than expressing. Miles, dollars, calories, gigabytes. And does this behaviour really help nourish our species? Or could we have been fooled in these first young decades of our online existence into thinking that all this choice helps us express ourselves, at the same moment that our species loses its ability to think freely? As Pekka puts it simply, do we really need all of this? Well, that's future fear. Where's Future Fantastic, I hear you cry? And where's the music? This November 2020, with fresh COVID lockdowns across Europe, it could feel like a repeat of the spring. Except this time around, Mahler Chamber Orchestra is replacing despair with determination and resignation with tenacity. Let me qualify what I mean. September and October provided a short performing window for us at the MCO. In Hamburg, Baden-Baden and Cologne we met, we performed and we planned for our future. A sustainable future, digitally, economically, environmentally. There were workshops, there were guest speakers from the classical music world, there was thought, and there was re-evaluation. Not necessarily of what can't be achieved in the future, but what can and must be achieved for the future. And we were on stage. And when we rehearsed, people cried. We were happy and grateful to rediscover the pleasure of making music together again in the same room. To me, it felt like we reaffirmed a pact that making music together produces a vital nutrient that nourishes the human soul. To finish this episode, I leave you with thoughts of our own musicians from the workshops and concerts in Baden-Baden, collected by Matthias Meyer and presented here as a collage of MCO reflections on Future Fear, Future Fantastic.
It was quite a nice surprise to suddenly have time and to be able to really practice. But at this point, it's really, I want to get back to work. I want to perform regularly. It's who I am. So
we have the experience of intensive collaboration with the audience, and it's strange to not be close to people anymore.
In the last 15 years since I've been on this continent, there's been an unbelievably lively scene. The concern is that we kind of understand, that we kind of get used to it not being so lively anymore. And then we're just like, okay, that's how it is, right?
The future of younger people, especially music students, will they even decide to study this? That worries me the most because it will change the whole culture.
In different countries, you see how it's politically handled, that musicians are asked to train for other jobs. That's just horrendous.
Until now, I know that I'm good at playing violin, and I studied for being here and playing my instrument. I'm not sure if I'm good enough in other things.
This whole stuff which is going on online right now, the people posting a lot of projects and are trying to find new ways in media to promote or to publish, is a really good way to start establishing a media presence for us and for artists in total. That helps us staying relevant during these times of not being able to perform live for live audience right now.
I think what we need to do as live musicians is really capitalize on the live experience. The formats themselves, I'm not worried about that. I'm up for anything. We have to use the tools that are out there.
I hope we will actually find ways to still always put the music in the center. That's the most important thing.
Surely there are people who are really afraid and who are really pessimistic about the future, no question. But I don't know, maybe I'm just a really optimistic person. I don't feel afraid for us.
This orchestra is built up with deciding about the future, and if you are responsible for your own future, you think about it much more, and you're not just in this comfort zone just to get your money, and whatever happens, you do your job.
I hope that the music industry will recover and that the live event will be something people are just longing for after this time.
Yeah, live concert, you cannot replace that feeling.
Many thanks to all the MCO musicians who contributed this time, especially Tim Summers, Chiara Tonelli and Philipp von Steinecker for their artistry on their instruments. And of course, a huge thank you to MCO artistic partner Pekka Kuusisto for his insights, in interview and on his violin. The podcast team is, as ever, Matthias Meyer, Mark Parker and me, Yannick Dondelinger. Goodbye, and don't forget, keep listening.
Between the Bars.